That Jewish News Show. I'm Laura E. Adkins, the Forward's opinion editor.
And I'm Benyamin Cohen, our news director.
It is very hot and sunny in New York City. What's going on at the farm today, Benyamin?
Farm life is going a-okay. My dog Jolene just discovered a new place to take a nap, and it's like she dug a hole under a shed, and so
Okay,
she's sleeping under a shed, and she's supposed to
sure.
be a deterrent for hawks flying by. And now the hawks can't see her because she's sleeping under the shed.
Man, this dog is living the life, sleeping under a shed, not one but two dog showers custom for her. This,
Yeah. Oh,
man,
we
I
got
gotta
her a
get on.
doghouse. She doesn't even go in the doghouse.
Yeah, that kind of happens. I feel like you buy fancy toys for animals and then they want the cardboard box or the hole under the shed. But so it goes.
What's
Exciting stuff.
Yeah, yeah. That's all the excitement. What's going on with you?
So I am actually heading on Thursday to my best friend's bachelorette party in
Hmm.
Texas. I'm very excited. It's going to be hot. It's going to be lots of time on the lake and at the pool. So I will not be in work mode the second half of this week, but the podcast will be podcasting. So we'll join you again after I've had a full weekend of relaxation.
All right. So on today's show, up ahead, we will be joined by journalist Mark Chiusano. He's a politics reporter who's been covering the strange, sordid saga of George Santos for years, and actually has a book about Santos called The Fabulist coming out later this year. So we will be joined by Mark in a few minutes. But first, let's catch up on some news. It's only Tuesday, but there seems like there's been a lot of news already this week.
There have been so many twists and turns in the news and the Jewish news cycle in particular. For weeks, I've been accidentally saying George Soros when I mean George Santos and vice
Is that what I
versa.
said?
No, no, no,
Okay.
you said it right, but
Okay.
happens to be that last night Twitter CEO and Tesla co-founder Elon Musk tweeted apropos nothing that George Soros reminds him of Magneto, the villain from the Marvel Cinematic Universe. Now, I don't really know a lot about the X-Men or Marvel in general, but a quick Google search will tell you that the fictional Magneto, like Soros, was a Holocaust survivor, and when this was pointed out, to Elon on Twitter by several users who also pointed out that George Soros is the frequent target of thinly veiled anti Semitic attacks. Musk responded that Soros does not have good intentions and wants to, quote, erode the very fabric of civilization and that he hates humanity. Thankfully, our colleague PJ over in the culture desk wrote a pretty thorough explainer this morning of the situation, including the long backstory of Magneto's Jewishness. Forward opinion contributor Alex Zeldin went a step further on Twitter and called Elon's tweets anti Semitic incitement. What do you make of all this, Benjamin?
I mean, we've had this debate before, the two of us, and also in our newsroom. Is it anti-Semitic if you invoke George Soros? You know, the billionaire Jewish philanthropist. People always refer to him as a puppet master, and so we've had, if someone just says, George Soros is a Democratic donor, so a lot of times people are just who are Republicans will say, oh, that's a Soros funded Democratic campaign, and they're not necessarily. I mean, actually, I don't know, but they're not necessarily being anti-Semitic. They're just saying it's Soros. So,
Mhm.
do we know if Elon Musk was actually being anti-Semitic? What bothers me is more that, I mean, I'm busy enough as it is. I'm I just have one job, but like
Yeah,
Elon Musk runs like five different companies. Tesla, the boring company,
right.
Twitter, a solar panel company, a battery company. And he's got like he's got a lot of children, and it just seems like he has a lot on his plate. I'm not sure how he finds time or why he finds time to late at night tweet insults to people, especially a
Yeah.
92-year-old man.
Yeah, I mean the whole Soros conversation is really interesting. My friend and the author of The Influence of Soros, Emily Tamkin, has written for us and for others several times about kind of the fine line between legitimate critique of this person who has invested significant sums of money in progressive politics and in social institutions in the United States. And it can get tropey very quickly. I think we've even spoken on this podcast before about basically if you're sticking to what was actually done and what was actually said by Soros and are trying to critique specific actions, kosher. But when you make kind of sophomoric arguments that I agree with PJ that it was indulging in plausibly deniable anti-Semitism
Right.
here. I mean, what possessed him at 10 o'clock at night on the East Coast? I guess it was earlier if he's on the West Coast, but I don't know what made him want to tweet about this, but yeah, maybe
Do
more
you
important things.
Do you think that, like, Soros, as we said, is 92 years old? What do you think will be, 10 years from now when Soros, or 20 years from now, whenever Soros passes away, will he still be the boogeyman? He actually has a foundation, and so like
Right.
his money, the Soros Foundation, is still going to be around. Is he still going to be? People still going to be invoking him? Do you think, or will they find a new boogeyman?
Yeah, I mean it's interesting. You see this it's on a different scale, but for example, Sheldon Adelson who passed away, people are still critiquing institutions and his legacy philanthropically. Obviously, his wife is still managing the estate, but I think the biggest critique that you see of Soros by more like mainstream Republicans that slides sometimes into anti-Semitism is invoking this trope of the globalist, right? Like this
Right, puppet
it's a
master.
nicer way of saying puppet master essentially, but there's always going to be rich people influencing politics. Like that's how our system works ever since we opened things up. As Mitt Romney famously said, corporations are people too, my friends. Like rich people,
Right.
all the more so, influence politics in this system. So the trope of the globalist is not going away. I don't know who the next equivalent of Soros is going to be, but yeah, I am confident that folks looking to make anti-Semitic comparisons will always find something.
Right. Speaking of the Holocaust and Holocaust survivors like
Yes.
Soros, a story that caught my eye that we wrote about yesterday, our reporter Arno Rosenfeld wrote about yesterday, was there's a New York City auction house that plans to sell a number of Holocaust-related items this Saturday.
Oh
I guess
boy.
they don't keep Shabbat.
Yeah.
One of the items that really like made the headlines was a can of Zyklon B, which is the poison gas used to kill Jews in the concentration camp. They also have up for auction the yellow star that Jews had to wear in the ghetto, the bunch of Nazi memorabilia and armbands. The rule is this may seem it seems strange that they're doing this, and I
Yeah.
looked it up. Large auction houses like Sotheby's and Christie's usually prohibit the sale of Nazi items. Even on eBay, they'll take down an
Hmm.
item if it's an. But this is being done by like a small independent auction house in Brooklyn.
Yeah.
What do you think? Do you think it's okay to sell? I mean, on the one hand, these are historical artifacts. Do you think it's okay, or is it immoral to make money off of this stuff?
I mean, the line that blew my mind in our colleagues reporting on this is that an estimated half of the military antiques trade is the sale of Nazi items. Like, this is crazily common. I think it's gross. I mean, I do think that there's a big difference between buying a Jewish star and a literal can of poison gas. Like, I would assume that most of the federal agencies that track terrorist activity are also going to be looking at whomever purchases a can of Zyklon B. But I there was a movement several years ago by some folks to kind of reclaim the idea of the yellow Jewish star as a symbol of Jewish pride. It all feels very icky to me, and I would imagine that most of the people purchasing these items are not exactly people that are looking at the Jewish pride aspect and the reclamation aspect. But, you have all these artifacts. I feel like a good solution to me would be if you want to sell these things, all of the profits should be donated
Right.
to, supporting Holocaust survivors that are still living. The number of Holocaust survivors in poverty, both in the US and in Israel, is astronomical. There's certainly a lot of need here. So, all feels icky to me, but at least if they want to do this icky stuff, it should be going to help the victims of this tragedy that are still living. But I don't know.
Right.
It all feels weird. But in other still feels weird news, we had a crazy Giuliani story that also broke recently. Benjamin, what's happening?
So, America's favorite mayor, I'm putting quotes around that, Rudy Giuliani, former mayor of New York City, former or maybe current attorney to former President Donald Trump, was hit with a big lawsuit on Monday. Our Jacob Kornblue wrote an article about it and posted the 70-page lawsuit, which I spent an hour reading last night. It is riveting
Yeah.
reading. And it's basically by a former employee of Rudy's who is suing him for all sorts of things, creating a toxic work environment, sexual harassment, sexual abuse. And what was interesting to our readers was she said Rudy was very often made anti-Semitic comments just in his day-to-day being around him. And
As one does. Yeah, totally.
as one does, we have it up on our site, but and we'll put a link to it in the show notes. But he was Rudy Giuliani was making fun of the size of Jewish penises, and
Sure.
he was also making fun of Jews who celebrate Passover. I'm just going to read the quote here because I don't even know how to explain this. He goes, "This is Rudy talking. Jews want to go through their freaking Passover all the time. Man, oh man. Get over the Passover. It was like 3,000 years ago. The Red Sea parted. Big deal. It's not the first time that happened."
I mean,
That's
fair,
end
fair
quote.
about fair about the getting over the splitting of the sea, but our colleague mentioned that he texted Rudy for clarification on when the sea has parted previously. Still has not heard
or
back.
since.
Yeah, I mean the first part totally feels like a complaint of an old Jewish man about to sit down for his religious family's Seder, right? We do this
Yeah.
every year. Why do we have to read the whole Haggadah? But I mean, look, I do think that the Jewish approach to like tough things has always been humor, and including now, like Jewish Twitter is just going crazy, making fun, rightfully, of Giuliani acting like a buffoon. The complaint and the allegations in the complaint is definitely quite serious. As you mentioned, it's like wide ranging, includes sexual assault and harassment, wage theft, abuse of power. But I think that the anti-Semitic comments in particular just point out how unhinged this person is, and it shouldn't let him off the hook at all for his behavior. But this is a person that respectable right wing people really looked up to for a long time when he was mayor of New York City. I don't think liberal Jews have ever looked up to him, but it's just like he seems very off of his rocker. And again, it doesn't excuse anything, but
Right.
were these sentiments always lurking under the surface? Is this a new, late in life inspiration for anti-Semitic views? Who knows? But it's all a bit bizarro.
Yeah. So we'll keep track of that story. Make sure you go to forward.com and you can read the latest.
All the stories.
And speaking of crazy New York politicians, it's now time to bring on our guest, who's not a crazy New York politician yet, journalist Mark Chiusano. He's a reporter who has been covering New York politics for Newsday, known as Long Island's paper of record, for years. And many of us were just introduced to Representative George Santos, the freshman congressman who calls himself Jew-ish. Many of us were just introduced to him in the past year, but Mark has been covering the Santos beat since 2019. He actually has a new book about Santos called The Fabulist, coming out later this year. Mark, welcome to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. Much appreciated.
This Santos story is just like, it's the gift. I mean, for storytellers like us, it's the gift that keeps on giving. It's bizarre. He lied about where he went to college. He lied about his work history. He lied about his Jewish heritage and having relatives who died in the Holocaust. He's accused of writing bad checks, financial improprieties, stealing money from a pet charity. He lied about playing volleyball in college. And last week, the latest news was he was arrested on multiple charges, indicted on 7 counts of wire fraud, 3 counts of money laundering. I feel like I'm reading the Chad Gadya. 1 count of theft of public funds. And 2 counts of lying on congressional financial reforms. And if he's found guilty, he could end up in prison. So my first question to you is, did you always suspect something was up with Santos? I mean, you've been covering him for, like we said, for a few years now.
Yeah, what's interesting is I spoke to him in 2019 in I guess it was the fall of 2019, right when he was launching his campaign. And I was writing for a political newsletter that Newsday puts out called The Point, and basically it was just kind of a routine, call up this candidate, and he says he's launching his campaign, see what his deal is, and write a little just quick write up of what he's interested in. And so I call him and I say, like, Mr. Santos, nice to meet you, whatever. And he tells me that he's actually not in New York on the day that he's supposedly launching his campaign, or certainly the week that he's launching his campaign. He's in Florida for a business conference, which just seems strange to me. Like, why would you be launching a congressional campaign like thousands of miles away from the district, So that was strange. And he, kind of, in what we've sort of learned to just associate with Santos, he had tons of excuses at the ready, and they just sort of overflowed. It was, oh, my staff didn't realize, not a big deal, I'll be back tomorrow for a fundraiser. It just kept going. So that was the first sort of strange thing. And then, I kept covering him for Newsday, and there were often little strange things that he was doing. He was doing lots of kind of strange campaign finance filings that we wrote about. He never really was clear on where he lived. He moved around a lot. He would never answer questions. He was very vague about his biographical information. So it's been a long history with Santos, and there's been lots of great reporters doing work on this too, like your guys's as well. So it's been a lot of fun for everyone to jump on board with Santos.
You pointed out in your Time piece last week that you have essentially, chased stories about this man around the globe, and that as early as 2019, his lack of a permanent address and the campaign finance irregularities and things like that made you suspicious. How did folks miss connecting all of the dots on this to the extent that this man is now in Congress and perhaps will be, has already announced plans to run for a second term?
Totally. I mean, it was a little bit of a perfect storm. Everything kind of went right for this guy. First of all, it was a perfect storm in him winning election. It was this very strange red wave in New York that didn't exist around the country, but a lot of forces like anger at COVID and Lee Zeldin's very sort of semi-successful run in New York, nearly beating Kathy Hochul, really kind of pulled Santos along. So, you have like the political tailwinds that are helping him. You have a lot of journalistic resources being devoted to all these other really interesting, juicy local campaigns, including Zeldin's. So people were kind of paying attention to that. And there was coverage of Santos. We kind of forget that and we think of it as it went from zero to hero kind of thing. There was some very good coverage. I was writing about him a bunch. The Daily Beast covered him quite a bit of some of his irregularities. The North Shore Leader did a little bit as well. There were people kind of poking at him. But it's a small race. It was one race among many. He wasn't expected to win. He was very much underestimated, so it didn't kind of get to the national level. And then, the Times did this incredible work, obviously, sort of pulling all the pieces together and connecting the dots. Personally, I think that it was the Brazilian check fraud thing that really sort of was like, oh my goodness, like this is different. This is a real, this is, something's going on with this guy. And then the sort of cover got blown off.
Yeah, what exactly happened there?
With the check fraud situation, yeah. So I actually tried to go to the store in Niterói, which is this kind of city across the bay from Rio. It's closed now, unfortunately, though. But I spoke to people who kind of knew about it. He basically goes into this luxury importer in Niteroi, and tries to buy something, some shoes, and I think another item as well. Uses a check. The sales clerk is a little nervous about it, but lets him do it. And then later finds out that it was a bad check. Turns out the
Mm.
check came from someone his mother was apparently caring for,
Oh
in
gosh.
Niteroi. Yeah, and then there's a really kind of almost like literary line in the charging paperwork, in Brazil, where Santos claims he only did this one time. He never used the checks again, and then he like threw the checks. I think somehow the checks ended up in the water somewhere. I think the gutter or something. So I just have this image of the checks kind of floating towards New York, like across the Atlantic, and he does other check stuff here.
Yeah.
So that was, and then he leaves Brazil so soon after that.
He just it just seems like nothing surprise. I mean, everything and nothing surprises me about Santos, and he's just so audacious. He's just constantly lying. And it's one thing if he lied about, okay, he worked for Goldman Sachs, or he lied about being Jewish, or he lied about X or Y or Z, but he lied about all of those things. What is it about this particular moment in time we're in where it's so ripe for con artists? I mean, we're all familiar with Elizabeth Holmes,
Yeah.
Theranos, who the founder of Theranos, who just started her jail term, and Adam Newman and WeWork, was in many ways people looked at him as a con artist with that. We had the Fire Festival, the music festival that was kind of like a fake festival. What is it about nowadays that people just feel like they can just get away with all this stuff?
I think there's a few things going on. One is that it is very easy to kind of learn a lot of things quickly and kind of bone up on certain issues and certain kind of disguises through the internet, right? And Santos is, so almost anyone who knows him at all will say this, that he's a smart guy. He picks things up quick. He's a quick study. He has other issues and he kind of bumbles and fumbles as well. But he knows how to kind of put this disguise together, and he sounds very convincing. So he's the kind of person that can read up on something, and you'll think, talking to him, that he actually was a Wall Street executive or someone who knows about financial markets, something that I don't know so much about. I'm trying to bone up on that myself just to report on him. So I think that's part of it, that you can pick things up very quickly. I also think that we live in a moment where there is a lot of dispute about what is true. What are the sources that you can trust, right? Do we trust sort of mainstream outlets like the Forward or Newsday or magazines and things like that? Some people don't, right? And so there is always this sort of veneer of not being sure of what is true. I also think that actually helped him a lot in his run. He kind of
Right.
marshaled some of the forces of like misinformation about vaccines and masking, and
Hmm.
a bunch of Republicans sort of played in that sphere. He really kind of cultivated it, would show up at those protests, things like that.
Right.
The last thing I would
Right.
say, I do wonder if we're finding more con artists now just because it's kind of easier to like research someone's background. You can't do the sort of old school Mad Men or Great Gatsby thing of like, start over your life, be a new person,
Right.
walk out for
Right.
cigarettes.
I mean, he basically managed to.
Yeah.
But a line that struck me in your piece, the Time piece that I mentioned earlier, was, it's almost as if all of his shape shifting has deformed his sense of how a person should or needs to move in the world. And I can't help but think of former President Trump here, has also been caught up and, has lost cases demonstrating all sorts of similar things to the type of stuff Santos has gotten away with, and is still a very popular figure among his particular constituencies. Do you think that the same sort of Teflon effect is likely to happen with Santos? I mean, it does seem increasingly that voters care less about things like this and more about just sensationalism.
Yeah, he is very much courting that population, that sort of constituency. He seems to have abandoned the idea of, getting the kind of Republican, the Republican just kind of establishment to help him and support him through this. He is benefiting from the sort of very tight partisan breakdown in Congress, right? And so that's one reason that he hasn't been sort of expelled, or one potential reason. However, he's not really kind of playing like a middle of the road, Republican in DC. He's sort of making friends with these far right people. He's saying things that are sort of more and more outrageous every day. And I think that is because he knows that that's the last home he has left. The third congressional district is not particularly that's not the audience in the actual district that he's running in. He had this he sponsored a bill to make the AR-15 the official gun of the United States.
Right.
It's not really what the voters there kind of want.
Right.
So it's like, why are you doing that? There is a different, he's kind of pushing himself into a different constituency.
Right. He only won the race by, I think it was 8 percentage points. And there are so many candidates on the Democratic side throwing their hats in the ring recently, including, I think, yesterday or the day before, a 29-year-old Long Island. Basically, his entire launch video was just poking fun at all of Santos's lies. But what do you make of the other candidates so far that are challenging Santos? And do you think the GOP still has to kind of go along with Santos?
I think the GOP, the Nassau GOP in particular, has been very vocal about not going with him. So he's not going to be the Nassau GOP's candidate. There's a joke among sort of political people in Nassau County that there's no such thing as a Nassau GOP primary. It's funny, I actually even just heard Santos making that joke on a podcast from years ago. It's like a sort of a truism. Because they're gonna pick someone else, and so in their mind, Santos is not gonna survive that kind of attack, but that does not mean that Santos won't run. He can certainly run and continue to raise money and sort of be loud. So that's the Republican side. On the Democratic side, there's a whole bunch of people who are throwing their hats in the ring, although a lot of people are kind of waiting to see if there's a special election, because then it's the candidate is chosen by party leaders. It's a little bit of a different kind of race there. You're playing an inside game as opposed to an outside game. Perhaps a different candidate would win that, get the special election nod as opposed to someone who'd win a primary. So I don't think we know necessarily all the people that are kind of in the race yet. The last thing I would say about that is about the potential for a race here is that on both sides, no one's exactly sure who would be better off. If no one is exactly sure who's going to win this race, if Santos is in it or not in it. It's a kind of strange moment, and we're not exactly out of that red wave moment in New York that Santos won with. So I don't think anyone is super confident that their side is definitely going to win the third congressional district.
What are your, knowing what you know about the district and about Santos, what are your predictions? Do you think he will resign? Do you think he's going to go to jail or win re-election?
Right. So the prosecutors in their indictment last week said that he's facing up to 20 years in prison, right? Which is a lot. That's not typically what you would actually serve, right? There's sentencing guidelines, and we'll see how it goes. He could take a plea deal and get much less. But it's serious, right? And there's also a lot more that they could charge that could be to come. Part of while I was reporting this book, The Fabulist, is something that I found is just that this is the beginning, this is the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more wrongdoing that people have told me that Santos has done. And if you're a prosecutor who has subpoena power, I would imagine you could get much more than I was able to get as a reporter. So Santos has a lot sort of weighted against him legally. That typically pushes people to take a plea deal if they can, right? And especially if they don't have a ton of money to pay on legal fees.
Right.
So far, we don't know if he has much of a benefactor or someone to pay those legal fees for him. So one would think in a normal situation, you would take a plea deal, right? Santos is not a sort of normal politician, right? And one lawyer that I was talking to recently told me, look, why would a person who's just been indicted come outside from the courthouse and start talking
Right.
to reporters. Why would you just say no comment, take care?
Right.
So he's not doing the normal thing, and I'm sure he's calculating what's best for him. Is it better to sort of cry witch hunt and keep fighting as far as he can?
Yeah. I mean, it wasn't surprising. It was so funny that he came out and he's like, well, what about Hunter Biden? It was just like,
Yeah,
oh gosh.
of course.
I mean, there's a playbook for this sort of stuff
Yes.
that's, percolating down from the top. So,
Yeah.
And
Mark,
a long,
yeah.
yes, sorry, yeah,
No, go on. Go on.
a long history of that playbook as well. I mean, witch hunt is something that Trump says all the time, but it's
Right.
something that a former NASA GOP official who had his own legal troubles was shouting decades ago. So this is a long time phrase and refrain.
I'll have to try it
I
out
know you have
next time.
Witch
Mark,
hunt.
I know you have to. I know you're busy. I just got one or two more questions for you.
Yeah.
How do you, this story is literally unfolding before our eyes. I've written a book myself, not about Santos, but I know you have to turn in a book at least 9 months before to get it on the shelves. And you're still working on this book. Literally, the news is still happening. And when does the book come out? November?
It's coming out in November. Yeah, it's a real crash schedule.
How do you write a book on a political story that's still unfolding?
Yeah, I think that when I was coming into the book process, I had to think about that challenge. And so my solution was to focus a lot, as much as I can, on explaining who Santos is and how he got to the point of winning and of getting indicted, right? So at least so far, in my mind, the book is about his life leading up to indictment. And I think that, people can find coverage of his sort of political challenges and legal challenges elsewhere, right? To me, what is most interesting is what makes this guy tick? What makes this liar continue to lie even when all the eyes of the world are on him? So it's kind of a psychological study and a bit of a sort of grifter thriller of how did this man continue to keep grifting and keep kind of hustling even when he knew eventually he was going to get caught.
Fascinating. Mark, thank you so much. We'll definitely make sure to be on that list for a galley as soon
Absolutely.
as soon as you decide that the news has stopped happening enough
Right.
for you to turn in that final draft. But Mark, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
See ya. All right. That is super interesting. Yeah. I'm gonna pre-order a copy of that book as well. But it is funny. It's like literally he's still typing it, and you could already pre-order it on Amazon.
Yeah, it's pretty wild. I mean, this is such a complicated thing. Long gone is the era where, Robert Caro, who wrote these huge biographies of Lyndon Johnson, famously moved to the town in Texas where he was from, spent years and years and years, really deep dive. I can't imagine him just like being on Twitter all day watching what's unfolding. Like it's such a different way of reporting out these stories. But
Yeah.
in any event, yeah, we will be tracking it in real time also on forward.com. So we'll stay
Yeah.
on that Santos piece for you. But our recommendations of the week are not actually about Santos. I am happy to share mine first. It does relate to
Sure.
one of our news stories of the week, though. My dear friend Abraham Josephine Reisman, who wrote a biography of Stanley called True Believer, wrote a very nice piece in Vulture in 2019 about how Magneto became Jewish, explaining the backstory of some of the creators of the Marvel comics and the way they integrated their own life experiences in Israel and around Holocaust survivors into the backstory of Magneto. So if you're interested in doing a deeper dive beyond this Elon Musk tweet, I highly recommend Josephine's piece. We will put it in the show notes for you. Benjamin, what are you watching these days?
I'm watching a lot of things, but one of the things I was looking forward to watching ever since I saw the trailer was a new documentary about Michael J. Fox, who is probably my favorite actor. And there is a new documentary that came out. It's on Apple TV Plus. It's called Still, and it's about Michael J. Fox's career and his battle with Parkinson's. And my favorite line in that movie, he says, is, "With gratitude, optimism is sustainable." I just think that's such a good life mantra. With gratitude, optimism is sustainable.
That's a
Yeah.
great line. I think that's a beautiful place to end. Benjamin, thank you so much. It's always a pleasure. And thank you to everyone watching. If you hadn't heard, we now have both an official email account and a phone number to provide feedback in. We will put those in the show notes. Be sure to leave a comment if you enjoyed this episode, or if you didn't, it boosts us in the algorithm either way. But we will see you next week. Benjamin, take care.
Take care.